In this video, we're going to resolve how the role of the government changed between business and labor, how this led to political corruption, and how this, in turn, led to efforts of reform. Congress had enacted an ambitious reform program during the 1860s and 1870s. However, after the Compromise of 1877, the national government settled into an era of stalemate and comparative inactivity. Americans at this time shifted their attention away from national politics to economic change, the development of the West, industrialization, and labor movement, and the growth of cities. Politics of the era are often criticized, as mostly show with little substance. It was an era of forgettable presidents and politicians who largely ignored problems arising from the growth of industry and cities. We call this the era of populism. The idea of do little government was in tune with two other popular ideas of the time: laissez-faire economics and social Darwinism. The question isn't whether the government intervened or not, but on whose side they intervened and how effective were they. The government backed the side of business in the money question as exemplified in the crime of 1873, where Congress stopped coining the silver after already siding with creditors with the passage of the Specie Resumption Act of 1875. This law removed greenbacks or paper money from circulation. This effectively put the country on the gold standard. So both of these concepts limited the money supply, therefore benefiting big business. By the late 1880s, discontent began to spread within the minds of American consumers, workers, and voters as calls were made for government reform. As railroad monopolies took advantage of farmers, state governments passed Granger laws to rein in railroad greed. In Munn v. Illinois, the Supreme Court reaffirmed the states' rights to regulate the railroads. The federal government established the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate the railroad industry on a national level by passing the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. Attempting to end the policy of laissez-faire, the government passed the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 to create business competition. Unfortunately, the federal courts narrowly interpreted the government's powers to regulate business, and this limited the impact of few regulatory laws that Congress did pass. As government stance of pro-business became solidified, the workers lost out on labor issues. Between 1880 and 1900, workers went on more than 20,000 strikes to gain higher wages, benefits, and better working conditions. The government feared the disruption in the economy and sided with business. In 1895, the U.S. Supreme Court applied the Sherman Antitrust Act against unions. All businesses needed to do was cite a disruption in interstate trade to gain government intervention. Lower courts would also issue injunctions, which would force workers to end their strikes. Employers would almost always count on the support of the federal and state governments. For example, what did the federal and state governments do to end the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Homestead Strike, and the Pullman Company Strike? They sent in federal troops to break up those strikes. By 1900, the public had grown weary of all the strikes and took side with the government and business. To the public, this is what unions represented: dissension and unruliness. Farmers were not very happy as they had to deal with several problems during this period. One issue was that producers and farmers became more dependent on large and expensive machines, such as steam engines, seeders, and the reaper thresher combines. Larger farms of thousands of acres were run like factories. Unable to afford the new equipment, small marginal farms could not compete and in many cases were driven out of business. Increased American production as well as global competition from farms in Argentina, Russia, and Canada drove prices down. The static money supply in the United States in the 1870s and 1880s had a deflationary impact on prices. Deflation means prices going down. As prices fell, farmers with mortgages faced both high interest rates and the need to grow 2 or 3 times as much to pay off old debts. Overproduction only lowered prices, resulting in the vicious circle of more debt, foreclosures by banks, and more independent farmers forced to become tenants and sharecroppers. The economic depression of 1893 and the rise of the Populist Party were the culmination of steps to shake the Democrats and Republicans into action. Populists were determined to do something about the concentration of economic power in the hands of trusts and bankers, and address those concerns in a meeting in Omaha, Nebraska in 1892 to draft a political platform. A party platform is a formal set of goals supported by a political party or candidate to appeal to the general public for the purposes of gaining votes. Politically, it demanded the restoration of government to the people by the means of, number 1, direct popular election of U.S. senators, and number 2, enacting of state laws by voters themselves through initiatives and referendums placed on the ballot. The Populist Party also had economic goals. The platform supported unlimited coinage of silver to increase the money supply. They also supported a graduated income tax. A graduated income tax is a tax that charges more money to wealthy people than it would to people with less money. Number 3, it supported public ownership of railroads by the U.S. government. And finally, it also supported telegraph and telephone systems owned and operated by the government. The Omaha platform also called for loans and federal warehouses for farmers to enable them to stabilize prices for their crops. And finally, it supported an 8-hour workday for industrial workers. At the time, the populist movement seemed revolutionary, not only because of its attack on laissez-faire capitalism, but also because of its attempt to form a political alliance between poor whites and poor blacks. To end party patronage, the government passed the Pendleton Civil Service Act, requiring government employees to meet qualifications in order to be a government employee. Another way to put this is you had to take a test in order to get a government job. Jobs were based on merit instead of being assigned a job by one of your friends. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, formed in 1874 under the leadership of Frances Willard, who saw alcoholism as a social ill and advocated total abstinence from alcohol, and backed prohibition, or making it illegal. The Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1893 under the leadership of Carrie Nation, also backed the prohibition movement. The election of 1896 was one of the most emotional in U.S. history. It would also mark the beginning of a new era in American politics. Democrats were divided in 1896 between gold Democrats loyal to Cleveland and pro-silver Democrats looking for a leader. Their national convention in Chicago in the summer of 1896 was dominated by the pro-silver forces. Addressing the convention, William Jennings Bryan, leader of the Populist Party, captured the hearts of the delegates when he offered free coinage of silver in his famous Cross of Gold speech, where he said, quote, "We shall answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." It made him an overnight Democratic nominee for president. The candidate was only 36 years old. For their presidential nominee, the Republicans nominated William McKinley of Ohio, best known for his support of a high protective tariff, but also considered a friend of labor. Marcus Hanna, who had made a fortune in business, was the financial power behind McKinley's nomination, as well as the subsequent campaign for president. After blaming the Democrats for the Panic of 1893, the Republicans offered the American people the promise of a strong and prosperous industrial nation. The Republican platform proposed a high tariff to protect industry and upheld the gold standard against unlimited coinage of silver. The defection of gold bug Democrats over the silver issue gave the Republicans the advantage. Bryan countered by turning the Democratic populist campaign into a nationwide crusade. Traveling by train from one end of the country to the other, the young candidate covered 18,000 miles and gave more than 600 speeches. His energy, positive attitude, and rousing oratory convinced millions of farmers and debtors that the unlimited coinage of silver was their salvation. Mark Hanna, meanwhile, did most of the work campaigning for McKinley. He raised millions of dollars for the Republican ticket from business leaders who feared that silver lunacy would lead to runaway inflation. Hanna used the money to sell McKinley through the mass media, while the Republican candidate stayed home and conducted a safe front porch campaign, greeting delegations of supporters. In the last weeks of the campaign, Bryan was hurt by two things. Number one, a rise in wheat prices, which made farmers less desperate. And number two, employers told their workers that if the factories would shut down if Bryan was elected. On election day, McKinley carried all of the Northeast and the upper Midwest in a decisive victory over Bryan in both the popular vote and the electoral vote. McKinley was lucky to take office just as the economy began to revive. Gold discoveries in Alaska in 1897 increased the money supply under the gold standard, which resulted in the inflation that the Silverites had wanted. Farm prices rose, factory production increased, and the stock market climbed. The Republicans honored their platform by enacting a higher tariff and making gold the official standard of the U.S. currency. McKinley was generally a well-liked, well-traveled president who actively tried to bring conflicting interests together. As leader during the war with Spain in 1898, he helped to make the U.S. a world power. The defeat of Bryan and the Populist Free Silver movement signaled the end of the Populist Party on the national scene. It also initiated an era of Republican dominance of the presidency and of both houses of Congress. Once the party of free soil, free labor, and free men, the Republicans were now the party of business, industry, and a strong national government. The Democrats carried on in the defeat as a sectional party of the South and host of whatever populist sentiment remained.